As humans, we always need a place to put our stuff. After all, we go through life collecting stuff and then organizing stuff, and we need boxes for that stuff. So let's look at Egyptian storage. And what we're looking at in ancient Egypt are basically boxes or modified boxes. After all, a chest is really a box with legs. It might contain clothing or other household items, generally with lids that opened in one way, shape, or form. And those lids can take a number of different shapes. For example, we might see a gabled, like a miniature roof. We might see something that's rounded. We might see something pointed, or flat. There's a number of different varieties there. And they may have used frame and panel construction as early as the First Dynasty. Again, large pieces of wood are hard to come by. But the method does not become widely used until the Sixth Dynasty. And some argue that it's because they don't have enough stuff to really need more and more boxes. The people who really need them can already afford them. So we see here we have a box made up of smaller pieces that you can see where they're splitting. And here we see one made of solid slabs. And this is going to be for Coptic jars or some other religious form, because you'll notice there are engravings inside, whereas we wouldn't see that here with this other box. We also see the use of, at times, inlay or gilding. Gilding is applying a thin layer of gold over the surface. We see embellishment to large and small boxes. It kind of depends on who it's for and what it's for. Just like today, sometimes you just need to run to Home Depot and grab an extra large box to throw a bunch of junk in and throw it in the garage. Sometimes you want something really fancy, and usually it comes down to what's going in it. So we tend to have a fancy box for something like a jewelry box. We tend to have a Home Depot box for something like throwing our clothes in while we move across town. Same thing with the ancient Egyptians and ancient societies. They're not using wooden boxes for everything. They're using for specific storage purposes. Now we also see the use of hygiene boxes, which this is one of them. And that's going to be particularly important to them. These are known as toilet boxes and were made in the Middle Kingdom with various slots to hold vases and accoutrements necessary for cleansing. They're often veneered and polished to a high finish. This would be really important, especially if you're in the upper class. Now, the working class doesn't have to worry so much, because if I'm out in a farm field or building a pyramid or whatever else, I don't have to worry about how I look necessarily. If I show up shaggy, it's fine. But if I'm in the upper classes and making a lot of my living based on how I look and how I present myself, well, now I need that. And so we tend to see these hygiene boxes with these very high finishes because of where they're coming from in society. Now, an important storage item common to most cultures in some form of box is going to be used for the placement of the dead, or a coffin. It can range from a simple box, usually of wood, to an elaborately decorated or carved stone container that's meant to remain above ground. Now, in this case, we're looking at a coffin from the Middle Kingdom. The mummy was placed on his left side, which would have been facing east, with his head behind the two magical eyes. These, in the shape of human eyes, more or less, stylized, they're actually Horus eyes, effectively, to which have been added the markings of a falcon's head, and were supposed to enable him to behold the rising sun. This would enable him to be reborn daily. The long horizontal inscriptions are prayers to Anubis and Osiris for offerings of food and drink and other items necessary in the afterlife. The short vertical inscriptions place him under the protection of various other cosmic and funerary deities. This is a pharaoh's coffin. Now, it doesn't look anything like what we think of as a pharaoh's coffin because we're used to King Tut. We'll get to that in a minute. This is from the Middle Kingdom. The pharaohs are not very powerful people. They're trying to show humility to try and hold things together. It's not a great time to be an Egyptian. So we get these very simple coffins. What's inside it would be more ornate. There would be an inner coffin, so they have different layers to them. But it's basically a box. And you'll notice, because he's a pharaoh, how big these wooden panels are. Look at this piece. This is a solid piece here, or appears to be a couple of solid pieces, but very large compared to what we've seen in other Egyptian furniture. That stands out. We see the size of the box, which tells us it's particularly important. The paintings actually tell us that this is someone who is important, but not that important. Why? Because they've painted it rather than engraving it. It's also possible that he died at a time where it was, perhaps things weren't prepared yet, they weren't ready for his death, and when he died they had to throw something together in a few days that would be acceptable to the pharaoh. Now, what we're used to more often is something like this. These are the various coffins of Tutankhamun, the 3 innermost coffins specifically. So his mummy would be in here. I don't know where his daddy would have been. The eyes were open so that his eyes could look out through this mask, through was effectively a death mask. Inside of it was a gold death mask on top of his mummy. And then this would have gone inside the next one, which would have gone inside the next one, which would have gone inside a stone sarcophagus, which we see behind. And then we have 4 or 5 layers of silk canopy that would have been laid over the top. In effect, 9 different coffins made of different materials, leading us out from the body. Now, Tutankhamun ruled for 10 years. They were familiar with him. They were ready to prepare for his death, whereas our previous pharaoh maybe not. But this is where we get those ideas of the big fancy gold coffins. And I should point out, for construction, from the perspective of construction, these are wood and then overlaid in gold. So the wood material that would have been used are small pieces, sometimes veneers, that would be put together like plywood into a mold. You can just use heat, or if you cut it thin enough with veneers, you can simply mold it in place with glue and hold it in that position to create a very complex form like this. So these are no different than our other storage boxes. They tend to be what we think of when we think of Egyptian storage.